Welcome, everyone, to the third annual LogiCal-LA conference. So let's be clear about what this conference is about, and what exactly is scientific skepticism. Briefly stated by Paul Kurtz, one of the giants of scientific skepticism, a skeptic is one who is willing to question any claim to truth, asking for clarity in definition, consistency and logic, and adequacy of evidence. The use of skepticism is thus an essential part of objective scientific inquiry and the search for reliable knowledge. Carl Sagan said, "Science is a way of skeptically interrogating the universe, with a fine understanding of human fallibility. If we are not able to ask skeptical questions, to interrogate those who tell us that something is true, to be skeptical of those of authority, then we're up for grabs for the next charlatan, political or religious, who comes ambling along." At the heart of this movement is the quest for truth using scientific inquiry. With so much pseudoscience, we need a methodology that can be used to tell us not if a claim is 100% true, but to examine if a claim is most likely true. In other words, to provisionally believe a claim is true until more compelling evidence is presented. Science and scientific research can and will improve our understanding of social issues as well. But there is one issue that is overriding all of these issues. It's climate change. We are placing the human race in a precarious position for future generations as we ignore the prognosis of the world as a whole. As the SGU, Skeptic's Guide to the Universe, said several weeks ago on one of their podcasts, this generation is the one who must start to change our planet. It will be much more difficult for the future generations to make a significant change without doubling or tripling the cost to make that change. And most of the current world issues will diminish because all efforts will be placed on saving our planet. We should help other carbon-intensive countries change to a carbon-neutral energy sources. We hope you enjoy the stimulating lectures that our speakers have to offer.
So he is actually a one-time Christian who was into math, okay? Two things that I completely confused me as a child, so I can totally relate to what he's going to talk about. But really what we're after is the truth, okay? Aren't we? Really? That's what he's going to talk about, the truth. So give him a round of applause and let's listen to what he has to say. Thank you, sir. Thanks for being so kind.
Oh, almost lost it. Thank you for the opportunity to talk with you today. One of my current book projects required me to look into epistemology, and I thought I'd take a little bit of a chance to share what I've learned. I believe it's important to know what's true, but is it possible? How does such a process work? Is there such a thing as objective knowledge? And are we capable of true objectivity? Epistemology is the study of knowledge, and it has arisen because of the difficulty of knowing whether we are following a reliable process to determine the truth. Epistemology has also been weaponized by many religious groups. In some cases, they will say things like, well, how do you know that the universe is more than 5 minutes old? The implication is that if you don't know that, then how can you know that their claims aren't true either? And they often present the idea that we can only have a meaningful conversation about morality if we believe there's a God. So I wanted to step back and ask whether there is a meaningful way we can think about the search for truth. I wanted to start with an example. The New York Times produced an online test in 2015 that went something like this. There's an unknown rule. The sequence 248 conforms to this rule. And you have 3 boxes in which you can enter guesses, and it will tell you yes or no that it conforms to the rule or not. Is anyone here brave enough to try and guess what the rule is? Doubling. Okay, doubling. So what if the rule is doubling, what do you think we should test?
16.
So you're saying 16, so doubling it again. Okay. Any other guesses? Power? Okay. So what? Okay, so you're saying 2 to the 1, 2 to the 2, 2 to the 3. And so what might be your guess? What might you enter into those question marks?
3 and 3 squared, and then you'd have to guess 3.
Okay. So it's very interesting that this, and thank you for being brave enough to do that and to be the guinea pigs. It's very interesting that a lot of people did this test. They would enter things in. Both of those things that you put in would have received a tick. Okay, they would have passed the rule. And it turns out that 77% of people would guess what the rule was without ever getting the answer wrong. Okay, now we'll come back to why that's important. A little while ago, this is the kind of thing that happens in physicist households. My 8-year-old daughter told me that she had a new theory of gravity. I said, that's great. How can we disprove it? She looked horrified. And, the big blue eyes, it's hard to resist. She says, I don't want to disprove it, Daddy. I want to prove it. So I asked her to imagine that we have an egg. Okay, and I claim that this egg is incredibly strong, unbreakable. Okay, it's an unbreakable egg. And that she needs to carry it around with gloves and keep it safe. Keep it safe in a nice egg box. Is that going to prove that the egg is strong? Of course not. You need to hit it with a hammer, right? If it survives that, find something else to do. Pour acid on it, or throw it in the fire. If it's and all we're going to do is keep trying to break the rule. And similarly, in the New York Times test, we need to find numbers that break the rules that we think it's going to do, or that would pass. If we have a hypothesis, we try to disprove it. The success of early science led to the growth of logical positivism. Observables were meaningful, and unobservables were either meaningless or waiting to be observed. There's an idea in logical positivism of objectivity, that we can take an objective view and assess things as they really are. This is one of those ideas that we instinctively want to be true, but as philosophers have largely abandoned positivism. We can acknowledge that science has been very successful at uncovering truths about the world, but not claim that these are the only meaningful truths. For example, we may need a more general framework in order to discuss the notion of morality. Secondly, the notion of objectivity itself is questionable. When C.S. Lewis wrote Mere Christianity, he accepted logical positivism and argued that the existence of objective morality implies that there's a God. But nowadays, we're not as comfortable asserting that such objectivity is possible, and so the whole argument falls apart. Karl Popper then introduced critical rationalism. In this, falsifiability is used to demarcate science. It's important to note that it is the theory that is falsifiable, but not necessarily the predictions. So some predictions may be, and some may not be. For example, with the egg, we have the theory that it's unbreakable. That cannot be tested directly, but it predicts that it would survive a baseball bat. That can be tested. It also predicts that it could survive a black hole. That can't be tested, but that doesn't matter. This is something that apologists who argue against evolution commonly get wrong. For example, William Dembski makes an elaborate effort to demonstrate that evolution is not science because of the untestability of some of its predictions. So in the book, Evidence for God, he imagines a court case in which he's cross-examining an evolutionist, what he calls a Darwinist, and says, let me therefore ask you, are the following propositions scientific and as a consequence testable? 1, humans and other primates share a common ancestor. 2, all organisms on Earth share a common ancestor. And 3, life on Earth arose by material causes. Are the negations of these propositions therefore scientific and testable? And if not, why not? I respond to this in my book. If I were to land a rocket on Pluto, would it experience gravity? We assume so because gravity is a theory that has been tested extensively and its predictions have been found to be true. Evolution is a theory that's been tested and never been falsified. It makes complex predictions, such as the ones you gave, but the task of testing them is daunting. However, evolution has been so successful that we think those statements is likely to be as likely to be as experiencing gravity on Pluto, though both are hard to verify directly, at least for now. Thomas Kuhn abstracted this concept even further, introducing the term paradigm shift into the public consciousness. His view is that scientists are not as logical as Popper might hope. They tolerate falsifying results. So theories are not rejected, but adjusted. And eventually, these ad hoc adjustments build to the point where the whole thing just becomes absurd, and then the whole thing collapses in what we, in retrospect, call a scientific revolution. He was accused of sneaking relativism into science, but that was not his intent. He argued that paradigms were improving and represented progress. The two perspectives, Kuhn's and Popper's, can be harmonized if you imagine worldviews as just being very important theories. The world, in that case, we falsify worldviews with more difficulty, but the process is still the same. Now, these ideas apply primarily to science. And this makes sense because for many people, science is the closest thing we have to objective truth. But can we generalize these ideas to other forms of truth? Can we discover the truth of religion, of history, of morality? One attempt to do this is called critical realism. Critical realism is defined by N.T. Wright as the spiraling path of appropriate dialogue or conversation between the knower and the thing known. So he rejects naive realism, that is the notion that we have direct access to reality. Hallucinations and illusions show that we do not always have direct access to reality. He rejects objective and subjective knowledge, preferring the terms public and private knowledge. I've also heard it called inner and outer truths in a TED talk by paranormal investigator Carrie Popper. So where positivism claimed that people can take on an objective perspective, a neutral perspective, and assess claims objectively, critical realism acknowledges that biases always exist. So objectivity remains a goal, but we acknowledge that it may not be obtainable. However, I believe that it's important to make a subtle but important change, and that is from knower to knowers. I'm going to argue that this is the way to think about the search for truth generally. Before we get into this, I want to talk a bit about how we know that something is true. Each belief we have is supported by other beliefs. So how does this hang together? Broadly speaking, there are two thoughts on this. One is foundationalism. In foundationalism, we need to keep digging down deeper and deeper until we find a foundational belief that needs no support. Descartes famously said, "I think, therefore I am." He was asserting that this was a foundational belief, and everything else derived from that. Others, notably Hume, disputed it. We kind of intuitively want our beliefs to be foundational, but ironically, that idea is on shaky ground. The alternative is coherentism, where our beliefs are held true if they're part of a coherent network of other beliefs that we also hold true. It fits better with the idea of critical realism and perhaps collaborative realism as well as the idea that our worldviews shape our beliefs. The collapse of a worldview or paradigm shift happens when we recognize the incoherency of some of our beliefs. In practice, we tolerate some amount of incoherency, because if we have a large number of beliefs, we have a far larger number of possible connections between those beliefs. Each time we add a belief, we cannot compare it for consistency with every other belief that we have, so cognitive dissonance inevitably builds up. So what we have is kind of a network of beliefs. In this picture, each dot represents a belief. The outer cube structure is our worldview, and the cluster of beliefs hang from it and also support each other. When we get a new belief, we tend to just shove it in there, and everything adjusts. It may add tension to one part of the network, and relax another part. At some point, the tension builds to the point where the network implodes, and we have to rebuild it. And we hopefully rebuild it with fewer inconsistencies. We know that multiple possible networks are at least somewhat coherent. This should not cause us to shrink away from the search for truth. It should also not cause us to accept relativism. It should allow us to challenge each other's views in a way that assumes the best of intent. None of us has the complete picture. None of us knows everything. And of course, our beliefs affect society, and therefore they need to be discussed. These discussions will lead to improved coherency if done correctly. This discussion is the essence of what I've called collaborative realism. It supports the view in epistemology that projects like street epistemology come about, so in street epistemology, we're encouraged to take other people's views seriously and focus not necessarily on the precise view itself, but on how we know whether or not it's true. So there's discussion about, is that a reliable way to know something? Now, a network of belief can easily hide circular reasoning. When I was a Christian, I used to hold that God created the universe and that the universe was inspiring evidence of God's hand at work. In other words, creation pointed to God and God pointed to creation. At some point, I realized that this was circular reasoning. I saw non-Christians who were awestruck by nature, and I saw nature as both awesome and terrible, and so I eliminated one of the struts. Did that work? There we go. I decided that the existence of nature was not the reason I believed in God. This was just housekeeping, without a major shift in my worldview. But over time, I removed more struts, until eventually I realized that my belief in God was not supported by anything. And so I dropped that belief. And that was a major worldview shift for me. So this is an example of how we can shift our worldview over time, and I argue that this happens because of our interactions with other people, the conversations that we have in good faith. Now, I'm arguing for a kind of coherentism within this structure. But if we remove all cycles, then mathematically, there must be a foundational set of beliefs. I don't think we should take the mathematics too seriously here, but if there is a set of foundational beliefs, then they are hidden beneath the surface of a sea of formative experiences. For example, we may be born with the belief that my sense data are reliable, and then one day an uncle comes along and makes a ring disappear. You all know how that was done, but children don't. And so we see this and we think, do we update our foundational belief? Do we think that my sense data are not reliable? Of course not. With children, we just believe in magic for a little while. But gradually we refine and iterate our beliefs. We end up with beliefs like most of my sense data are reliable. We end up rejecting naive realism, and our network gradually settles until something big enough happens to shift it again. In general, these major shifts are relatively rare. It's inevitable, really, because it takes effort to rethink everything. And the evidence would suggest that people can kind of get along without solid epistemologies. There's another bias that causes us to be slow to change our worldview, and that is that we take on the views of the people around us. So the view that the people surrounding us are generally trustworthy is probably baked into our worldview from an early age, in most cases. And so we tend to align our beliefs with those around us. Now you may say, and in this room, hopefully most of you will, that you're an independent thinker. And I think that's hopefully largely true. But let's just think about, for example, general relativity. Most, hopefully all of us, would accept that as true. In other words, it accurately describes some aspects of reality. Few of us would be able to say what it actually is in mathematical detail. Fewer still would be able to tell us what the experimental underpinnings of general relativity are, and even few would have checked that those data are correct. And even fewer of us would know how to replicate those experiments to be able to check that they were right. My point is that we accept general relativity because our worldview incorporates something about the trustworthiness of the scientific method. And so we incorporate beliefs from that group of people for ourselves. Oh, sorry, that happened. I'm not saying that's bad. It's inevitable. But changing groups from, say, Scientology to science is a difficult shift to make. The point is that we are not such independent thinkers as we may think we are. We have been persuaded of our views by the people we interact with. It falls on us to make the case that the scientific method is a reliable way to know what's true, as opposed to, say, faith, or however that's defined. So how do we weigh up different networks of belief? And what do we even mean by better here? When a new belief comes along, we tend to just squish it into our structure and perhaps bolster it with a few more assumptions. This is a bias, but I think it's a necessary one for us to get on with our daily lives. On the other hand, we need to be willing to acknowledge that our frameworks need a little housekeeping once in a while, even if our humanity resists it. Part of the reason that our networks are relatively impervious to change is that we judge which network is better using beliefs from within the network. For example, I met a Christian at a talk the other day who explained that his views were justified because they made him a better person. He said, "The trouble with you atheists is that you're just obsessed with the truth." So here we have a situation where one worldview is considered better regardless of whether or not it was a better reflection of reality. Truth was not the standard that his worldview was using to judge itself. But this is a talk about truth. And last weekend, I visited the Nixon Library, where there's an Apollo 11 exhibit on. I was reminded that Nixon's speechwriter wrote a speech in the event that the astronauts ended up stranded on the moon. Absolutely horrifying possibility. He wrote, "Fate has ordained that the men who went to the moon to explore in peace will stay on the moon to rest in peace. These brave men, Neil Armstrong and Edwin Aldrin, know that there's no hope for their recovery, but they also know that there is hope for mankind and their sacrifice. These two men are laying down their lives in mankind's most noble goal, the search for truth and understanding." So mankind's most noble goal, the search for truth and understanding. So how do we know which network is a better reflection of reality? A common method is Occam's Razor. We look for the simplest solution, other things being equal. But elegance in one sphere may require complexity in another. For example, some people may say that God is the simplest solution for everything because we have a literal deus ex machina. So in ancient Greek theater, conflict and drama would sometimes rise to the level of chaos. And then an actor dressed as a god would be lowered from a crane and just put everything to right. Even at the time, it was considered to be a lazy storytelling device. But similarly, all our theories may be crumbling into chaos, but God has a mysterious reason for it all that is beyond our ability to comprehend. It's certainly a consistent view. But of course, it only works by assuming a being that's more complex than the universe. So that's not exactly simple. In fact, it's no explanation at all. Alternatively, we may say that natural explanations are always preferred. But then, are we smuggling in our preconceptions or our worldviews into the assessment? I would say we are. Naturalism should be argued for, not assumed. So perhaps we can say it means that the network with the fewest ad hoc assumptions. But this, in turn, may just end up amplifying our differences. For example, I may look at your network and say mine is better because it has fewer ad hoc assumptions than yours. But that's just from my point of view. You may look at my network and say it has fewer ad hoc assumptions than mine, from your point of view. And in any event, we can't see each other's complete networks. So again, this emphasizes the need to have a conversation and to understand each other's viewpoints. This is collaborative realism. It's the epistemological framework that I'm proposing. It is an acknowledgement that truth is always a collaborative endeavor. So I try to convince you, and you try to convince me. And together we draw in as many as we can into the conversation and spiral in towards the truth. The scientific method already does something like this, but we can apply this to truths about religion, history, morality. We reject the notion of objectivity. This allows us to disagree with someone while maintaining mutual respect. Nothing breaks down a conversation faster than the belief that my belief is objective reality, and anyone who cannot see that must be evil, stupid, or ignorant. Similarly, we reject the notion that of a universal foundational truth. In other words, a truth that needs no argument in its favor. Every view needs a reasoned defense. We also reject a false equivalency or relativism. Some structures are better than others. Truth is about the discovery of which is better. We accept that people are slow to change. We accept that we do not know everything, and we enter into dialogue with each other about these beliefs and about the reasons why we have those beliefs. One framework for doing this is known as street epistemology. Peter Boghossian wrote a manual for creating atheists, which introduced this way of talking about why they believe certain things and whether those methods are reliable. How many people have heard of street epistemology? Okay, wonderful. We were asking whether there's an app for this. He and Richard Dawkins wrote an app called Atheos, which demonstrates a good way to have these kinds of conversations. I wrote a book called Evidence Considered, a response to evidence for God, which responds to 50 Christian apologetics and explains why each is not convincing to me. On collaborative realism, the authors would welcome the scrutiny of their arguments. Based on their response so far, I assume that they are not collaborative realists. To conclude, I would say that the contribution of collaborative realism is to encourage us to discuss truth with those around us, whether it's friends or families or strangers in the checkout line. From experience, I know that it is sometimes uncomfortable to bring up these conversations, but that they're almost always a fun discussion to have. Science is collaborative and brutal, and I believe the same methods should be applied elsewhere. Thank you very much.
Hello. Hello.